So in this video, I'm going to show you how to assemble this star block. This is the day 2 star block of my 2025 Star Week Challenge. You can get the free pattern in the link below this video. So the pattern includes instructions to sew these diamonds together. And now I will walk you through assembling the block, which involves Y-seams. So the first thing we do is pair up our diamonds because we're going to sew our star together before we start sewing the background. So I'm just going to place all of them right sides together, and I will show you with this one first. So on the wrong side of the top diamond, we are going to take our fabric marking tool. I use this Sew Line pencil. This has a blue lead in it. You can get it in all sorts of different colors. You can also use a regular pencil or another fabric marking tool. And what I do is line up the 1/4 inch mark on a ruler with the edge of your diamond here on this side and make a mark like that. Then I will put my ruler along this edge, the 1/4 inch line lined up along the edge there. Make a mark there so the two lines will intersect at a point. Then I'm going to line up this edge here and then this edge, and we are going to pin. So the first pin will go through this point where the two lines intersect. So make sure these two edges are lined up and insert your pin through that mark. Then if you have any seams that need to line up, like this one has these two seams and then this point, we need to make sure those will line up too. So we pin at each of those points also. I like to make sure this center point always lines up because we want the center point of our star to be nice at the center. Okay, so I have 4 pins to make sure each of these intersections lines up good, and then this is where we need to stop sewing. I'll stop with my needle down on my machine and then back stitch 2 to 3 stitches. This is what that seam looks like now. You can see I stopped stitching at that point and back stitched. Now I'm going to press this seam open. And then after I press it open, I will start sewing this to another pair after I continue sewing these. So you will have 4 units that look like this, and then we will start sewing those together. So here is our 4 pairs. Now we will sew these together to get 2 halves of our star block. So take 2 and we will make the same marks like we did to sew the pairs together. So on the wrong side of your top pair, make 2 lines along the side, and where those 2 lines intersect, a 1/4 inch in from the edge will be where we insert our pin, and that is where you stop your seam. So just pin these like you did before, and then we will start sewing here and stop our seam here. Again, I like to put pins at each point where there's a seam that will intersect, making sure that the center one always comes together. Okay, so start sewing here. So all the way to this point and then back stitch 2 to 3 stitches. Then we will also press this seam open. Here are the 2 halves for our star block. Now before we sew these two together, I'm going to trim along this edge. So I do that for a couple reasons. One, just to trim off these dog ears will make that seam come together a little easier. And then to make that center point line up just right, we want to make sure that we are exactly a quarter inch from, I'll show you on this one, from where these seams to come together to the edge. So if I line up this line with the center of that star, you can see there'll be some to trim on this block. And that will just make it that much easier to sew together. And then I'll do that on this half. It might just be trimming off dog ears, but that's okay. It just reduces the bulk and will make it all easier to sew together. Okay, so now get your pins and your marking tool. So this is the bottom. We will place this one face down. I make my quarter inch marks along each end because we need to put pins there. That's where we will start and end our seams. Okay, so before I pin through those marks, I'm going to pin through my center point here. So you will take a pin, place it through the seam right there where all those seams come together. And you can see where it comes out on that side. So don't push it all the way through yet. We are going to then put the pin through the seam on the bottom, and it'll come through at that point where all those seams come together. I'm going to leave this pin vertical like this. I'm going to flatten or press these two together, the two halves, then take a pin and on one side of that pin put it through like that, and then on the other side do the same thing, making sure the edges are also lined up. Okay, so I have two pins on either side of that center point. Now you can take that pin out. If we try to pin through that point, it sometimes makes things move a little bit. So that's what I found is the best way to make sure you have that perfect center point. Now I'm going to pin these points here where our seam will start and stop. Okay, so these are the three most important pins you'll do first. Then you can pin at each of these seams. Just take your time when you're sewing. When you sew over the center, your seam should go right over where all those seams come together. All right, last one, and then I'm going to sew these two halves together and then press my seams open. Okay, here you can see my center point came together exactly like I wanted to. It's pressed open, now we can sew our background to our star. And the first thing I start with is these triangles. This was a square that I cut in half along each diagonal to get 4 triangles. So I've already made my marks on the wrong side of this fabric here. It's going to get sewn to this edge first. So if this is the right side, flip it to this side here. Then you're going to insert your pin through the marks, the intersection of those marks. Then I flip this side back so I can see what I'm doing a little better. This pin will go through the last stitch on this seam that sewed these 2 diamonds together. So you can see here, it's going through the last stitch there, and then it's coming out like that. So then I'm just going to line those edges up and pin them together. And when I sew, I'm going to start sewing on this edge here. Stop sewing at this point and backstitch 2 to 3 stitches. Then I will show you how to sew the other side of that Y seam. So this is what that will look like. Now we will flip this background triangle around so it is along this edge. Sometimes it takes a little bit of finagling, but there we go. These 2 edges need to line up here. So you can insert a pin through, this still has a mark on it, the mark or the last stitch of those 2 of that seam. And then your pin needs to go through the last stitch, in the hole of the last stitch of the seam you just sewed. And then it'll come out at the intersection of those marks. It'll take a little practice to get used to that, but once you do, you'll get used to that feeling of putting your pin in that last stitch. Now once that's in, you can line up your edges, smooth them out, and then pin along this edge. Okay, so I'm going to start sewing on this side and then stop at that mark and backstitch, and then I'm going to press this seam open, and then I will show you how to trim. So there's your first Y seam. Once you press it, it should lay fairly flat. That's how you want it to look. Okay, now I'm going to trim off these dog ears here. And then you will sew the other 3 background triangles just like this one. So I'm just going to line up my 45-degree line on this ruler and then the edge along this side and just trim that off. And then just do the same thing here. Okay, so that's 1 of 4. Now I'm going to sew the other 4, and then I will show you how to sew the background squares. So here's the block so far with the 4 background triangles sewn in there. All my seams are pressed and my dog ears are trimmed. Now we get to sew our last 4 squares into the corners. Okay, so this is the same as any other Y seam, but I'll show you how we do that part. So line up the 1/4 inch line with the edge of your square on the wrong side, make 2 marks, and where those marks intersect is where we are going to pin. So I'm going to put this on this edge here. I'm going to pin first through these marks, and then I'll move this a little bit. Then I'm going to flip this side back and insert your pin where your seam ended, sewing these two together. Now just make sure all the edges are lined up, nice and flat, and pin all the way to the edge. And I usually do at least 4 pins. All right, so then we can start sewing here, stop sewing here, and backstitch 2 to 3 stitches. Then before we press our seam, I'll show you how to sew this side to this edge. So that side is sewn on. Now we are going to flip these 2 sides together. And then pin through the point where this seam ended here. And then make sure your pin goes through where you want it to go through. The point where those 2 seams that you just sewed ended. And kind of take some moving around to make sure those edges are nice and flat. There we go. And again, pin a few times along this edge. I recommend at least 4 pins. Okay, I just like to make sure everything's nice and flat before I pin, so there's no puckers or bunching or any like fullness that you don't want. Okay, now we will start sewing here, stop sewing here and backstitch. Then we will press this seam open again, and then I will sew my other 3 background squares to those corners. Here is the finished block with all 4 corners sewn in. All my seams are pressed, and yeah, everything came together how I wanted it to. So if you want to make this pattern, you can click on the link below this video.